And take it away.
Okay, well, since a bunch of people joined while we were mid-introduction, I will go ahead and introduce myself one more time. My name is India Viola. I use she, her pronouns. I'm excited to be here tonight, and I'm really excited to see the large turnout. That's not always the case, and I have to admit, it gives me a little bit of the jitters, because it's stuff that I've taught over and over and enjoy talking about. So almost everybody is sort of
India, I think you're freezing up a little bit just to make you feel better about things.
a bike making. Oh, I'm being recorded. Okay.
So I fell offline for a second.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Dar.
Back.
I think we're back. Okay. If that happens again, I'll just keep going and assume that you'll be back. So after an hour, you don't become a professional bike mechanic, and that's okay. It would be ridiculous if you did. And it might give you the more classes that you take. So there is some of the other topics that we cover in other classes and go in a little more detail. The most recent class was about brakes and brake adjustments and brake maintenance. There is a class on shifting and derailleurs and maintenance of derailleurs. There's a flat fix class. So that's the class that I think Elaine was saying, an emergency bike fix. The flat fix is sort of the biggest emergency bike fix that someone might do. And we go really in depth with how to fix a flat. Tonight's class, and there are a couple more topics. So we won't be going in depth into too much other than the chain lubrication and cleaning. Everything else will be kind of a gloss over, just because of the amount of time that we have. That said, there is now on the internet a near infinite array of tutorials and people who are wanting you to watch them and teach you how to fix things. There are also some other educational opportunities around town depending on pandemic and non-pandemic. So the first thing that I will do is have everybody who's, so in the chat, I posted, and I posted a link to a Google Doc, and it's the one that it says, from me, I say, try this link to the Google Doc, it will let you view, and you can copy and edit on the document if that's what you want to do and take notes. And I got a confirmation that that link worked. So it was like the third time that I tried to post it. If anybody has any issues opening that, you can let Dar know, or you can just follow along, and feel free if you want to take a minute and grab a pen and paper now, you can. Otherwise, you can just come back and watch the recording, or just follow along and listen and see what you come away with. It's a lot of information, and so if you're hearing some of this for the first time, just let it be that you'll remember some of it and not all of it, and that's okay. That's how learning goes. So the document that I am looking at is the one that I shared. It's the annual bike maintenance guide, and it looks like I updated it about a year ago, and I haven't looked at it since then, so let's dive in. So, the other thing I would love to say is I welcome questions. If you post a question in the chat, Dar will see that and eventually read it out to me. If you'd rather just unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free to do that. I'm happy to answer questions. Sometimes my answer is let's table that and we'll get to that later, but feel free to ask and I will try to answer questions to the best of my ability throughout the time that we're doing this. So ABD. So there's something called the ABC quick check, and I amended it to be the ABD quick check because that's more in line with what I recommend for people to do. So the ABD quick check is something that, and so the recommended sort of service schedule is user discretion. So some people are very detail oriented, very routine oriented, and very disciplined. And some people will take me on my word and do this every time they ride. Some people go, yeah, I know I'm supposed to do that. Yeah, I'll do it when I think of it, or I'll do it when I want to. And so again, these recommended sort of service maintenance schedule is an ideal. I will fully admit that I do not do all of these things in a timely manner. Doing them in a timely manner can lead to better lifespan of parts and on your bike, and I'll try to talk about that when that's relevant. But you know, whatever you've been doing, if you keep doing that, that'll be how things are. And if you change your behavior a little bit and do a few other things, so every little thing is an improvement, and it's exciting and fun, and whatever you do is fine. So the ABD quick check, the recommendation is that this is something that you would just do before you jump on your bike, and you would have your kids do before they jump on their bikes, and you would just have everyone you know, and you just spread the love and spread the word. This is something we can do simply every time we get on. It's just a safety check. So the first thing you want to check is A stands for air in your tires. So you just want to do during the flat fix class, I really we use the gauge on a pump to measure the air in the tires. And that's really the best way to do it, but not necessarily the most convenient. And so pushing on the tire to see if it's flat is sort of a quick and dirty. You can tell if there's air in the tire, no air in the tire, a lot of, you know, it's very firm or it's squishy. If you're not familiar with what your tires, how they're supposed to feel, what I would recommend is looking on the side of the tire. There will be a written, sort of probably in raised, sort of embossed writing. It'll tell you the recommended pressure. It'll say either it'll say maybe 85 to 120 psi, or 30 to 65 psi, or 20 to 45 psi. And those ranges have to do with different widths of tire, different volume in the tire, different style of tire, and different riding. But there'll be a recommended inflation for specific tire. And what I would recommend you do, if you don't really know what that feels like, I would recommend that you get a pump and pump up your tire to that recommended pressure, and then feel it and sort of get a sense of, okay, your hand is not great at telling 85 versus 100, but it will tell you if you're kind of in the, like, if you feel what it's like at maximum inflation recommendation, you'll know what it feels like at half or no. So you can kind of use your thumb and hand as a gauge to tell you whether your tire has enough air for you to jump on your bike and ride. And we go into more detail in the flat fix class of sort of the benefits of riding with more air in your tires. And so I'll go into a bit of that right now and then move on. So when you have low air in your tires, and it's really the tube inside the tire, but I'm just going to use the language that we sort of conventionally use. So when you have low air in your tires, unless it's tubeless, and I'm not talking about that, things squish around and move around a lot. So you can get flats from abrasions that way. You can do damage to the valve stem that way because it's moving around. And you can also get what's called a pinch flat, which is when you're riding along and you hit a curb or a railroad crossing, railroad tracks, or a big bump, and your tire goes like that. and the tire squishes against the rim because there isn't enough air to protect it from doing that. And you end up pinching the tube and getting what looks like a snake bite or pinch flat. And that can cause a flat tire. So there is a good reason other than just me telling you to keep air in your tires. It protects the rim from a lot of the shock of riding, and it also keeps you from getting preventable flat tires. The second in the ABD quick check is the B. It stands for brakes. And you just want to check, depending on what types of brakes you have, you just want to pull the brake levers. If it's a kid's bike with coaster brake, they can check their coaster brakes by riding a short way and making the coaster brake active. But on most of our bikes, we're going to have some sort of brake lever on either side, and you can squeeze the brake lever and just make sure that it is causing the either rim brake, meaning that either the brake shoes to grasp onto the rim and stop the wheel front and rear, or with disc brakes, it would be the pads that are part of the brake assembly gripping onto the metal rotor that is the disc, not the rotor, I'm sorry, the metal disc that is attached to your wheel that spins with the wheel, and when the disc stops, because the ceramic brake pads clamp on it, the wheel also stops. So you can just test and make sure that the wheels lock up when you pull firmly on the brakes. During our brakes class, I go pretty in depth on sort of how you would we'll go a little more into brakes in a minute. And then the D stands for drop test. So this is a test that you sort of have to know your bike to do it. So what I would recommend is if you taking off any sort of wobbly accessories. So if you have a pannier, a bag, or a lock in a bracket, or water bottles, just things that are going to rattle and stuff, just take those off. And then you just take your bike frame and lift it up, not even an inch, and just let it come down with gravity. And what you're doing is you're just listening for rattling, and just to sort of see, okay, if you have a rack on your bike, is your rack loose? And you can kind of use your echolocation to find just your sound, just where things are coming from. You can just tune into where that rattling might be, and if you do hear sort of extraneous rattling on your bike, it gives you a sense that maybe something is amiss. The last part of the quick check is the quick part, and so it's quick release. And what I mean by quick release, there can be a few different quick releases. Most brakes, but not all, have some sort of quick release function, especially, well, rim brakes, I should say, have quick releases so that they can come away from the rim, and that's when you're doing a flat fix or taking your wheel off, you can pull your wheel out from between, the tire can pass through the brakes. So you just want to make sure if you've recently taken your wheel off that you've hooked the brakes back up. So that's the brake quick releases. And then your wheels may or may not have a quick release lever associated with them. And so if you do, you just want to make sure that the quick release lever is really snug and tight and closed, in the closed position, so that your wheels are not in danger of coming loose while you ride. So that's the ABD quick check. So brakes, for anybody who was in the brake class, this will sort of have a different sort of foundation to sort of sit in and make sense, but hopefully for everybody. So there's something called a barrel adjuster, and it is a tool that's part of the bike that allows you with your fingers to adjust the brake cable tension. And so the barrel adjuster, I don't have brakes on this bike. Yes, I do have one. So I'm just going to show you an example. If this is something that is very confusing to you, that's okay, because you can look it up if you want, or you can come to the brakes class someday. But on this bicycle, this is the brake lever here. And this is where the cable housing is coming into the brake lever. And this is a bolt. It's the head of a bolt that is going into the brake lever. I don't know if the lighting is going to let me do it. I don't know if you can see. It's hard to see, but there's a slot right here where you can, if you were underneath this bike and actually had better lighting, you'd actually be able to see the threads of a bolt sticking through. This is the head of the bolt. There's threads coming through right here. And what I can do with the barrel adjuster is I can loosen it, meaning dial it out, or tighten it. And when I loosen it or dial it out, it actually tightens the brake cable because it creates a little bit more space that the brake cable has to travel, and the brake cable has not gotten any longer. So the result of having a longer path that the same length cable has to travel is that it tightens up the brakes. And so if I did that a lot, I would actually make it so that it didn't have to, now I don't have to pull very hard on my brake lever. And that would be a little abrupt and too tight. So the way that I had it, I'm dialing it back in, which is the tightening direction of the bolt, but it's loosening the cable. And now I can pull further on the brake lever and the brakes are a bit looser. So when would I want to do that? You might be wondering. I hope you're wondering. And the answer is two-part. One is after you get a new bike, or if you have your brake cables replaced. Brake cables are strands of wire that are wound together. And so as they get pulled, tightened, and loosened as you're using the brakes, they slowly unwind. A little bit like if you were to braid your hair in the morning, and then by the end of the day, that braid might, and it was like nice and tight and up close, and then by the end of the day, the braid might loosen out a little bit. And so your hair isn't getting any longer. So the strands of the cables are not getting any longer, but the coil is, the strands all together is unwinding. And so the cable is, that's what we mean when we say cable stretch. So it's that it's actually unwinding and acting longer. And so that would make it so that the brakes felt a lot looser after time. And that's a lot of what the 30-day tune-up, when you get a free tune-up after you buy a bike, part of what they're doing is adjusting the brake cable tension to tighten it back up after the cables unwind. And so that's an instance where you might tighten up the cables using the barrel adjuster, dialing them out. The other thing, the other time that you would do this is just over time as your brake pads wear. So as you can imagine, I hope, the brake pads, and I'm talking about rim brakes right now, but the same is true for ceramic pads and the disc, just on a kind of a smaller scale. So a rubber coated brake pad hitting the rim, it's like an eraser. And so the surface of the brake pad is going to wear and wear and wear and wear. And so after a while, rather than being really, this is the rim and this is the brake pad, rather than being so close, the surface is going to wear away. And so you're going to have a bigger space. And so in order to pull that brake into the rim, you're going to have to pull further and further and further on the cable. So it's going to, the brakes are going to feel looser and looser and looser over time. And as that happens, you can take up that slack using the barrel adjuster on the brake. The next thing that you want to do is for brakes on a regular basis, but it's sort of, this is all as needed due to the conditions in which you ride. You can wipe down the rims. That's always a great idea. And you can just use a rag to do that. You can use a damp rag if you like. A lot of times the stuff from the road, dirt and grime, and also the wearing of the brake pad, all of that is gonna, some of that will stick onto the rim. And if there's the best braking you're gonna get is when you have a nice roughed up brake pad and you have a very clean rim. That's gonna give you the best braking. And so when either of those surfaces are dirty or there's something in between them, then you're gonna have compromised braking. And so wiping down the surface of the rim is a good idea. And then roughing up the surface of the brake pads. And so the brake pads are, if you have rim brakes and they're rubber on the outside, they're metal on the inside, but they're rubber on the outside. And that will tend to, with friction and braking, it'll tend to get what we call glazed. It'll get shiny and it'll have a less of a grippy effect on the rim and not as good braking. And so every so often you can undo the quick release on your brakes and look at the surface of your brake pads. And you can use sandpaper, but even better is emery cloth, which is just sand. It's like sandpaper, except it has a cloth backing, so it doesn't just wear away as quickly. Another thing to do with your brakes is to check the pads for wear. And again, it depends on how often you ride and in what conditions. So salty, sandy, that tends to abrade that gets on the rim and that gets in the brake pad, and it tends to wear away the surface of the brake pad much more quickly. So if you're a fair weather rider and only ride when it's sunny and the roads are kind of clean, then your brakes will last longer. So people like to ask the question of sort of how long will my brake pads last? And it's a little bit like asking how long your shoes will last. They will last as long as they will last, depending on if they sit in the closet, they're going to last a long time. And if you wear them every day, they won't last as long. So I have on here, I think every few months, but again, that would be adjusted depending on what type of riding you do and how often. And the general rule of thumb for brake pads is that they have grooves in them, and the grooves have two purposes. One is they help shed water and dirt and stuff when it's between the rim and the brake pad. They help your braking be better, but they also act as wear markers, similar to the grooves tread on your shoes or your tires. And so when the grooves are gone, that means you're getting really close to the metal of the brake pad that the rubber is covering, and you don't want that metal exposed. You'll know if you get to metal, you'll see it and you'll hear it. And it's pretty rare. People usually notice that their brake pads are worn before there's any metal exposed. And then checking the position of your brake pads. And I just have every 6 months, and that's just a ballpark figure. But the reason why this is maybe more important than you might even imagine is that over time, the brake pads are continually, they come in, and again, I'm talking about rim brake pads. They come into the rim either they either come like down, like if you have this type of brake, they either come down and in on an arc, on this type of arc, or they come up and in if they're attached down below. And so they come on this kind of arc. So they're traveling on an arc. And as I said earlier, as the surface of the brake wears away, they become further away from the surface of the brake pad becomes the new surface is further away than the old surface to the rim. So they have to travel further on that arc. So they're either traveling further up than they had been, or they're traveling further down than they had been, which means over time, depending on where the pivot is on your brake's either going to start to hit the rim higher up or lower down. And the issue with that is you get the best braking when the brake pad is just really hitting the rim squarely and the entire brake pad surface is hitting the rim. If the brake pad is up above the rim, it will start hitting the tire, and it can actually cause wear the tire, abrade it pretty quickly, and cause you need new tires because it'll wear right through the tire. You're also not having great braking. If it's too low, what happens over time is the bottom of the brake pad is no longer hitting the rim, and so just the top is, and so the top is wearing away and the bottom is not, and it starts to form this really nicely, kind of beautifully fitting groove on the brake pads. And after some amount of time of riding like that, what will happen is that the brake pads on the rim, the springs that pull your brake pads back away from the rim after the cable is, you've left off of the lever pulling the cable, will not be able, it'll be such a nice tight fit that your brake pads will actually just get on the rim and stay there. And it's a bewildering phenomenon to people when it happens. It's not particularly dangerous because it just makes it hard to ride and unpleasant, and you know that something's wrong and you'll see it, it'll just stick. And it just means that you probably need new brake pads. So every so often, every few months or every 6 months or so, just check and see and make sure that your brake pad is hitting the rim nice and square, and not like this and not like this and not like this and not like this, not like this and not like this. And so if it isn't, you can either come to the brake class and we can talk about brake pad adjustment, or that's something that a bike mechanic can fix, or it's something that you can look into learning how to fix or adjust. Okay, questions on brakes before I move on? There's a lot more about brakes, but this was my sort of quick and dirty overtime adjustment. Okay, if you have questions, feel free to pepper them in, but I'll keep going. Drivetrain and shifting system. So this we're gonna get into in about 15 minutes. I'm gonna pivot off of this handout and we are going to get into, I'll demonstrate. Usually we're doing it together and you're doing it on your bike. I invite you to do it on your bike if you have your bike with you and you have something to cover your floor. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So lubricating your chain, I'm not going to get into it now because I am going to get into it in a little while. But basically lubricating your chain. If you ride every day, once a week is a wonderful goal for that. Tonight you'll find out it's not difficult. It does take a few minutes and it is a little bit messy, but it's something that if you do one bit of bike maintenance on your own, it's a really great bit of preventive bike maintenance. What happens is the chain is made up of lots and lots of small moving parts, and if they aren't lubricated, they start to wear, and as your chain wears out, it wears out the gears, and then things start to not work as well, and they also tend to be expensive. And then the other suggestion is that if you ride in the rain or snow or other elements, sleet, as some of us do, that it's a really good idea to re-lubricate after your chain has dried off, maybe a day later, next morning, or hours later, depending on the season, is to lubricate your chain, because what'll happen is even though the chain lubricant that we use is not water soluble, it still can get driven out by water. And so when the chain is being pelted on all sides by water, that can drive out some of the lubrication. And so it's a good idea to re-lubricate your chain. Replacing your chain, which I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of how to do that tonight, although it is not I'd say it's something that if you want to learn how to do it, you can, without too much, without putting in too much time and effort. But replacing your chain every 2,000 to 3,000 miles is a really good idea. So that gets back to the sort of preventive maintenance. So lubricating your chain and then a routine replacement of your chain, which may or may not be something that you've ever heard before. I wish it was something that everybody was told when they were handed a bike, handed down a bike, or buying a bike. Is that the chain is actually a, I don't want to call it disposable. I don't like to think about it that way, but it is a piece that wears out and needs to be replaced over time. And so if you have, like, some people use a computer by computer, or they just know how many miles they put in. So if you know when you've hit 2,000 to 3,000 miles on your bike, that's great. If you don't, I have this very sort of rough, back of the napkin way to do the arithmetic. So if you ride X miles per day, X times a week, X weeks of the year, you can get to a rough, and it can be rough, it's fine, rough estimate of how many miles you put in per year. And that will give you a sense of how soon you may or may not hit 2,000 to 3,000 miles. So for some people, it could be 2 or 3 chains a year, and for other people, it might be a chain every 3 or 4 years, just depending on how often you're on your bike and how far you go. So I just say, if you're a commuter, replacing your chain once a year is a reasonable thing to do. If you're a high mileage road rider, or you're training, or you're racing, or you're a peak performance rider, twice per year is probably more appropriate for you. Questions about that?
Yeah, I got a question.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't replace your chain, or I
Yeah.
guess the question is, how does the chain affect the cassette?
Yeah. Okay, how does the chain affect the cassette? So I don't know who's talking because I don't have I'm looking
sorry,
at, that's
this
okay.
is Matt, and I just to elaborate,
Yeah.
like, if I were not to change the chain after 2,000 miles, would then the stretching of the chain damage the cassette? So
Yeah.
then because a lot of shops will say, oh yeah, you need to replace the cassette with the chain.
Yes. So sometimes you need to replace the cassette with the chain. My hope is, and I'll circle back to that in a moment. My hope in giving this advice is, so the sort of quick and dirty answer is, if you don't replace your chain in time, then it will wear out the rear set of gears, which is the cog set or cassette. Those are interchangeable terms these days. So your rear set of gears is a chunk of, depending on how many gears you have on your bike, it might be 8, 9, 10, or 11 gears in the back, something like that. It's not the old, and if you have 10 speed, it would be 5 in the back. So and those gears are smaller in size than the large gears in the front, which are chain rings. You might have 1, 2, or 3 chain rings in the front. The chain rings and the cassette both wear with the chain, but what happens is, in the front, you might have, a nice big section of chain wearing on, pulling, because the chain is a loop that's being, as you're driving the pedal forward, you're driving the front chain rings, and they're pulling on the chain, and that's pulling on the gears on the back with the chain. So everything's like yanking each other under a lot of stress. And then when you're shifting, you're asking the chain to sort of move back and forth this way while it's doing that too. So over time, the chain, you might have a nice big section of chain, and so the stress is distributed on the front gears, whereas on the back gears, it might be a much smaller section of chain. And so the stress is much more concentrated on the back gears, and that's why the rear gears, as the chain wears, the rear gears, which are being dragged along with to move your bike with all of the weight of you and your gear on it, that will start to wear out first, and then the front gears eventually will also wear out with the chain. So Matt used the term chain stretch, and so it's sort of like cable stretch, where there isn't actually anything stretching as far as metal goes. What is happening is that a chain is made up of 2 outer plates, 2 inner plates, some bushings, which are little roller bits that go outside that sit in the gear, and then a pin that's pressed in that holds the whole contraption together. And so a link of a chain is 2 inner plates and 2 outer plates, and goes from here to here. That's one link of a chain, and there are a lot of pieces, a lot of bits. So what happens is, as this wears, what happens, it's sort of like a joint or a hinge, a hinge type joint with lots of pieces that are moving. The pin is, this is all like pulling against each other. So you can imagine the bits that are rotating. The pin, the outside of the pin is getting worn down. The inside of the plate where it's rotating around the pin is getting worn down, and eventually the pin's getting a teeny bit smaller, that hole's getting a teeny bit larger, and eventually, instead of just going right through the center, it's doing this. So it's becoming sort of like that, and every single half link of the chain, instead of this, is now going this. So from any pin to the next, that space is lengthening because things are doing this. And so the chain stretches over time, over the whole length of the chain. All those little bit of wear and tear accumulate and add up. And so a chain can stretch a significant amount over time as you ride. And then that can, and the gears, the chain actually sits on the gears and sits in the teeth of the gears, go right through, the teeth of the gears go right where my fingers are, and then the chain, the roller on the chain sits in the scoop of the gear. And so that what actually wears out is the scoop of the gear becomes more shallow and wider, and that wears a lot. That has to accommodate the chain, because the chain has to sit in there if you're going to get anywhere. So what happens as the chain stretches, the gears wear and wear and wear more and more and more. So the rear gears tend to wear out. What tends to wear out? Your favorite gear. So that's a plug for using all of your gears. The more you sit in one gear, the more it's going to wear out, just because you're pushing and pulling on that gear.
India, I just wanted to reiterate what you said earlier, which is that every little bit that you do to improve your bike maintenance is great. But if you've gone 26 years without replacing your chain and you're not upset about it, then that's probably okay. It's just that your performance will improve if you're maintaining your bike and periodically replacing parts that wear out.
Yeah, thanks, Dar. So true. Yeah, and so one thing to remember is that if you take an old chain and the stretch is not visible to the naked eye, it's just something that can be measured and felt in performance. If you take an old chain that has a significant amount of wear and stretch, it will not fit on a brand new set of gears, and vice versa. So if you take a old set of gears that have worn with a chain and you try to put a new chain on that, it won't fit anymore, and it'll be and there's really no fixing that. The only fix for that is replacing, if the two have worn out together to the degree where they're not matching up with a new thing anymore. If the gears are worn to the point where they're not going to mesh well with a new chain, that's when when you take it in, that's when you're going to hear from a shop, we also need to replace your rear gears, and once in a while also your front gears. And they're not, that's not something that they're saying just to say it or just to take advantage of you. They're saying it because the chain that you have is no longer compatible with I'm sorry, the gears that you have are no longer compatible with a new chain. And so sometimes the best bet is, if you've been riding a chain for a long time and you know that if you take it in, they say we need to replace it. If you're able to live with the way that your bike is performing as is, if you haven't gotten on the front end of this and done preventive maintenance, which you wouldn't know to do until somebody tells you to do it. So if you're not on this every 2,000 to 3,000 mile chain replacement schedule, which will help you stave off needing a new chain and gears for a long, long time. If that hasn't happened, then it's up to you to decide, well, do I want to just like let this whole system wear out together longer, or do I want to plunk the money now or later for replacing those parts? Adjusting the shift. So now I'm switching gears because we're going to get back to chain.
India, I was just going to call it a couple things in the chat. At one point, someone asked about type of chain lube and whether or not you need degreaser. And then now also, if you replace the chain regularly, will you not need to replace the cassette?
Right. So I think I answered that last question. I wouldn't say forever necessarily, just because that would be an overreach on my part. But yes, the sort of impetus behind replacing your chain on a regular basis is to make it not necessary to replace your gears. The other question about which lube and do we need degreaser, I'm going to table for like 2 more minutes until I get to, I'll address that when we get to the actual hands-on chain lubrication. So thank you for those questions. So I'm going to kind of speed through the rest of this handout. You can read it on your own for sure, and you can look into it further. Adjusting the shift cable tension, which is generally has to do with your rear gears and because those are the ones that you're usually using more often, and so and then those rear gears tend to wear out a little bit more. So as they wear, things get a little squirrely, and so sometimes you can make up for it a little bit with your shift cable. But basically, the sort of same rule applies as brake cables. After getting new, either after getting new shift cables or a new bike that has new cables on it, you're going to want to, after the first month or so of riding, you'll notice that your shifting system is not shifting as well as it had been, and it's usually because those new cables had unwound. If it's a new bike, bring it back to the shop. They'll adjust that, no charge. But if it's a bike that you're taking care of on your own, there's a barrel adjuster that you can locate is where the housing meets the rear derailleur, where the cable goes into it, and you can dial it out in the loosening direction for the bolt, but it's to tighten the cable, or you could dial it in, that's how you would loosen the cable. As the derailleur springs wear, sometimes then you can have a nice snappy shifting as you're pulling on the cable and shifting up into the easier gears in the rear. But then all of a sudden you're finding that it's not coming back down into the harder gears, which is driven by a spring inside of the derailleur. So what you can do is sometimes sort of split the difference and loosen the cable a little bit with the barrel adjuster by dialing it in a tiny bit. And if you do that, you have to kind of go between, if you loosen your cable too much, you're going to have a hard time shifting up into the easy gears. But if it's not loose enough, you'll have a hard time shifting back down into the harder gears. So you have to kind of decide where that balance is best for you. And oftentimes what you need to do is make the adjustment and ride it, because under you can when you're riding, the stresses that you put on the bike and everything makes everything act a little bit differently than it would in a stand, which is why mechanics will test ride your bike, not just work on it on the stand, to make sure that things are working well after they've adjusted things. If you're consistently having trouble shifting into your harder gears, so I just have this sentence here to help as like a reminder, then you would want to tighten your cable. This is the harder gears in the back, not the front chain rings. And if you're having a consistent time shifting, a consistently challenging time shifting back down into the easier gears in your rear gear cluster, then you'd want to loosen the cable. If you are having trouble shifting in both directions, it's not a cable tension problem because the cable can't be too tight and too loose. So that's when you start to think things might be worn out, and that's when you'd bring it to the shop to get it diagnosed. Checking your crank bolts and chainring bolts for tightness once a year, or you can leave that to the shop when you bring it in for a tune-up. They'll do that for you. So the chain rings are affixed to your bike via a series of bolts, and you just want to make sure that they're not loose so that you don't have things flopping off when you're not expecting. And the crank bolt is right here is my crank, which is the arm that reaches out to the pedal from the center of the bike. And at the center of the crank is a bolt. Sometimes there's a dust cap on there that you need to pry off. Sometimes it's a Allen wrench or a hex wrench. That would be an 8mm. Sometimes it's a bolt with a wrench flats on it, and that would be a generally, I think that's a 14mm. But you need a little socket to get in there. But again, those are something that a bike mechanic will do during a tune-up.
Someone asked about replacing cables and housing when you were talking about cables and housing.
Oh yeah.
So
do you need to replace cables and housing? Good question. Not really unless they're acting up. So sometimes if you're having shifting or braking issues and it's not a problem with the brake pads or the brake levers or the shifting system, it might be if you can do an observation of the cable along its path and just make sure that the housing isn't cracked through. If it is, dirt and water can get in and gum up the works. And also cables and housing.
Imagine if a cable was kinked.
Yep, and if a cable's kinked, it would add a little bit. It would just, you might notice it. If you probably won't notice if your brake cable's kinked, you probably wouldn't notice a thing because you're just gonna overcome that with the leverage. Your shifting would probably be pretty compromised if your shift cable somehow got kinked. Shift cable tends to be a lot more finicky than brake cable. So cables and housing, inside of the housing, you want it to be a nice dirt-free, water-free, lubricated system in there. And so that is something that mechanics will look at and check during a tune-up. So for the people who are sort of lamenting, I wish I didn't have to spend so much on my bike. I empathize with that, and we all want to keep as much of our money as we can in our pockets. But another way to kind of think of it in perspective is if your bike is either a really nice recreational thing for you that helps you with your stress and overall health, or it might be an auxiliary or even your main form of transportation. Putting some hundreds of dollars into your bike on a regular basis, although that might feel prohibitive, if you think of it like a car on gas alone, you're just spending that, or on your bus pass or whatever. So it's I would try to sort of reframe, like it's the money that you're putting into your bike is a really good investment. I'm hoping that with some of this, you can put less of it over time in doing, if there's some preventive maintenance, but bikes the parts wear out over time and do need to be replaced. And so, you know, eventually you're gonna need new brake pads, you're gonna need new tires, you're gonna need new chain, you may or may not need new gears. Your derailleurs wear out over time with the spring. So, you know, aside, there's a lot of your bike that's sturdy and will never wear out, but a lot of the parts, they have a lifespan just like everything else. And so I would just sort of like plan on spending some money on your bike because it deserves it and you deserve it. And if you know someone who relies on their bike and you know they don't have the means, you can help them out by it's a wonderful gift is to give someone a tune-up or something, a gift certificate to a tune-up. And there are a lot of small bike shops around town. There are a few big ones too, but I've known a lot of bike shop owners over time, and they are not out to make money. They are doing it because they love what they do and they're really community minded. And so if you take your bike to a shop where you get to know the people who work there and you get to know the person who owns it, you'll see where your money's going. And it's really just supporting usually the brick and mortar, supporting the workers who are putting in the time to take care of something that is important. And then, so a tune-up is, so this is sort of, that's my kind of intro into a pitch into get your bike tuned up. It's a really great way to keep your bike in really good working order year after year after year. And so now is a wonderful time to get your bike tuned up. If you wait another month, you might be waiting a week or 2 or 3 before you get your bike back when you bring it in. Right now, maybe you're getting ahead of the rush. So on the off season is a really nice time. I know that most of the bikes were and will continue to do curbside transactions for tune-up. So what happens in a tune-up, sometimes depending on the price of the tune-up, sometimes some bike shops have a tune-up, some have a light tune-up and a more a couple of different price structures for tune-up. So sometimes they'll take the entire all of your gears, your entire drivetrain, everything off, clean it up real well in solvent and put it back on and lube it up. They will always be checking the rotational parts of your bike. So your steering column, which is the headset, the hubs, which is the center of the wheel, the bottom bracket, which is the rotational part of the at the bottom where you're pedaling. All of those have ball bearings and parts that have a lot of friction and rotation. And so those wear out over time. And so they will check and adjust those and replace things as needed. So when you take your bike in for a tune-up, there will be a standard charge, and then they'll say, we'll call you if the other things need to be replaced and more labor has to go into it. And oftentimes they will mostly charge you just for the parts and less for the labor because they're already doing a lot of the labor with the tune-up. So if you think you're gonna need some stuff on your bike fixed, oftentimes getting a tune-up is a really good package deal for that. And then they will check your brakes and brake pads and cables and make sure they're all really well adjusted. They'll let you know if anything needs replacing. They will make sure your wheels are nice and true. If anything is broken, they'll let you know, and they'll let you know if something needs replacing. The derailleur and derailleur cables and shifting system, they'll make sure everything is adjusted and working as well as it can. And they'll tell you if something needs adjusting in order to make it work better. Replacing. And then they'll also check your chain for wear and do a nice cleaning and lubrication of the chain. And then this is just another sort of encouragement, if you have a bike that you want to keep for a long time and you love it, or you have a bike that it's kind of gone a long time without a tune-up or without regular maintenance, and you want to keep that bike in good and have it be back in good working condition. If you're planning on upping your mileage and using your bike a lot more than usual, going on a bike tour or doing a special ride with longer rides, then it's a really nice way to increase the lifespan of your bike, is to get an overhaul. And they do everything that they do in a tune-up. They also just take everything apart that can be taken apart on the bike, and they clean it up, and they will replace all the ball bearings and cables and lubricate everything and make sure that your wheels are really well true, meaning running really round and straight. And so your bike will come back either in like as close to as new condition as your bike can be within reason. And so overhauls do tend to come with sticker shock. I don't even know what they cost anymore, but it's probably more than you've ever thought of spending on your bike. And it's at that point, maybe I should get a new bike, but new bikes have gotten more expensive too. And so a good bike that fits you well, that you're comfortable on, is sometimes is worth putting a fair amount in to keep it going and be safe and fun to ride. So now we're going to transition to the chain lubrication, cleaning and lubrication. So the person who asked about do I need solvent and what kind of lubrication do I use? I'm just trying to find the chain lube that I brought up. Interesting. No, you do not need solvent. I'm baffled. Okay, that's baffling. So you can use solvent. So there are chain kit cleaner kits that you can buy, and my sort of stance on them is unnecessary but maybe fun. So you clamp them on, you fill them with some degreaser, you run the chain. They have lots of bristles and brushes. They're usually clear. You can watch them working. They clean the chain as you run the chain through them, and then when you're done with that, you let it dry and you do a thorough lubrication of the chain. But then you have this thing full of greasy degreaser that you have to deal with. And so may or may not be worth the time and trouble. But if you're a gadget person and that's gonna make you wanna clean and lubricate your chain more often, then I say go for it. As far as what type of lubricant to use, I brought up a bottle and it really seems to have vanished into thin air. I tend to just use I think I have to run down to the basement and grab a bottle because.
So I always use something with Teflon in it that comes in a dropper bottle. It looks like Matthew uses T51. I think I've used T51 before. But usually any bike shop, you can get like their little, I think they're like 3 or 4 ounce bottles. Or you could get it online if you wanted to. And that's probably what India is. We can hear you. We can hear you in the basement.
Yep. So
back.
It was right where I left it. It is camouflaged down there. So now I'm going to switch so that I can see my camera. Pop back in. Okay. So there are some chain lubes out there that are non-petroleum distillate. They are made from vegetable sources. Sorry, I'm out of breath. And so if you have the inclination to get yourself one of those, I highly endorse that. I think it's a better solution for the long term for all of us. But if you're trying to pinch your pennies or just didn't get that, I use TriFlow, but that's not an endorsement of the brand. It's just because it tends to be the thing that I've gotten easily. So I don't think you can really go wrong. If it says it's a chain lubricant, it'll work. There are dry lubricants and wet lubricants, and the sort of general rule of thumb for those are a dry lubricant is more of like a wax base, so the wet part evaporates and it just leaves like a waxy coating. Tends to be better for dry conditions. Moab, summer in Madison with no rain, that would be okay. But for most of the year in Wisconsin, I would go with a wet lubricant. And I think Dar said with something with Teflon, that's great. The idea of tonight is that you're going to be doing this more often maybe than you otherwise thought you would. So the lubricant actually matters less. It's more that you do it often enough because the lubricant gets washed out and pushed out and drips out. So no matter what lubricant you choose, it's more that you're doing it on a regular basis. So tonight,
someone was asking about one-step cleaner and lube. I don't know if they're talking about WD-40 or I've never heard of other. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Thank you, Dar. Yeah, so I would stay away from one-step cleaner and lube if it's WD-40. If there's a new product out there that a bike shop is selling, I'm sorry, my head's cut off, but
finish line product apparently. I'm assuming made for bikes. If they
then it's probably good and great. The one thing that we do tend to try to tell people is not to use WD-40. WD-40 is really a degreaser. It's good for getting into locks where you don't want any lubricant left over, and it tends to evaporate out. But that's not what you want to happen on your chain. You actually want lubricant to get into the moving parts and stay there for as long as possible until you get to replace the lubricant the next time. So I'm going to just flip my bike over, exposing the chain to you.
Just going to warn you, you got 10 minutes, India.
Yep. So we'll do this, and it shouldn't take you 10 minutes to do. It should take you about 5 minutes to do. So the reason why it takes so long when we're in class is because everybody's doing it and asking questions at the same time. So what I do, and what I've done in my house, and I would recommend you doing this in a place that you don't mind it gets greasy. So since I'm in my house, I've laid down a large piece of cardboard under my bike so that, and then I'll have to clean up afterwards. But basically what I do is I take the lubricant and I'm going to, I'll just do it. I go over the rear gear cluster and I'm just going to drip, 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 drip as I pedal through. So I'm just pedaling, and so the chain's passing underneath this bottle. That's drip, 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 drip. And I just do it until I see chain come back around shiny. So that's when I know I've gotten the entire chain nicely and well lubricated. So the way that I'm cleaning the chain tonight is that I'm using this lubricant to work its way inside all of those little moving parts of the chain. And it's going to, by doing that, it's whatever is currently in there, if anything, is going to be pushed out, including dirt and grime. So the new lubricant is replacing old dirty stuff. And once I'm done with that, then what I do is I'm going to do an abbreviated, for about a minute, you just want to pedal through. What you don't need to do is run through your gears. You don't need your chain ring or your gear cluster, your cassette or your cog set in the rear to have lubricant on them.
I think that answers Todd's question.
Yeah. So what lubricant does on the outside of things is attracts dirt and sand and grime. And what lubricant does So that's on the exterior surface that we can see. Where we want the lubricant to go is in between those plates and pins, and inside of that roller bushing. We want all of the places where metal is contacting metal. We want there to be lubricant between those surfaces, but we really don't need lubricant. If once you wipe things off, you're gonna always have like a very fine coating of lubricant on the outside, and that's plenty to keep away rust. And this chain I have neglected. It's very rusty. And so you'll see, so the thing that takes the longest when you are lubricating and cleaning a chain is the wiping it off part. So wiping it off, you can very gently pedal through while grasping the chain, and that'll take off. This is a fixed gear bicycle and very dangerous because it doesn't have the bit in the rear hub that makes it so that you can coast. So when this bike pedals backward or forward, everything is moving and driving. And so when I let go, I can get, if you let go on your bike, if it's not a fixed gear, the wheel will stop spinning and it'll just go into coasting gear. On this bike, it won't. So my finger could get pulled in and caught in the chainring. That won't happen to you if you don't have a fixed gear bicycle. But the way that I'm going to do it, and the way that I think actually gets the job done a little better, is what I'm not going to put. I'm going to put more lube on because my chain is so filthy.
If you just go slow and be careful until you figure out what you're doing, so you don't get sucked into the.
Yeah, there are some sharp bits, and so you just don't want to. So on my bike, I'm using extra precaution that is really extra and unnecessary for most people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rub the exterior, the top, the bottom, and both sides of the chain. And then I'm just going to run a little bit of chain through and do that over and over. And you'll see I'm getting mostly like grease and rust off. Depending on what the state of your chain is, you might be getting grease and dirt off. Oftentimes it's a very dark color because of the color of grime on the
lube is often sort of clear,
yeah,
or semi-clear. So you think, oh, this is grease on my, but it's really dirt.
It's really
or dirty grease.
Exactly, it's dirt colored lubricant, or in my case, rust colored lubricant. And so the lubing up your chain is sort of the first half, or the first step. And it's important because without lubing up your chain, the lubricant can't get in and it can't lubricate the parts. But arguably, just as important is wiping off, and like as you run this through more and more lubricant will kind of seep out. Some will stay in, but a lot of it will seep out over time. As you're doing this over the next 4 minutes, it'll continue to seep out. And so I would want to be running the chain and then wiping it off as I see shiny and dirty, grimy, or rusty lubricant. And so now this rag is pretty much done. And so I'm going to switch. I'm just using old cut up t-shirt. So you can use any sort of cloth that you have at your behest. Oily rags are a fire hazard. You do not want to leave them in your house to sit, and you don't want to reuse them, sadly, because they might get partially clean in the washer, but then when they go in the dryer, they can still be soaked with quite a bit of oil. Dirty rags, if they sit, they can spontaneously combust, and in the dryer they can combust. So once you've used, you really want to use something that you're letting go of and saying goodbye to when you're doing a chain lubrication. So goodbye to this t-shirt. I'm going to take it outside to throw it out when we're done with this. And the next one, if your chain is newish or you keep your bike pretty clean, you might just need one rag, and you might just have to do this for a couple minutes, because this is my winter bike, and I haven't used it in a long time, and it's been gotten very rusty and dirty, and I haven't done this in a timely fashion. So I'm grateful to you all that I'm actually doing this. I would have to sit here and do this probably for the next 10 minutes, which would go beyond the scope of beyond the time in the class. But that's really the ins and outs of the chain lube. It's dripping the lube on, making sure you have a space that you don't want to get, that you're okay with having grease drip down, running it through the chain so that it seeps into the moving parts, and then just having the patience and spending the time to get it nice. And so really your chain should look something like this when you're done, sort of not too shiny, not too dirty. This is not a brand new chain, but it's much cleaner than the one on my bike. And we have 2 minutes, and I'm happy to take questions.
Cleaning chain rings, cassettes, maybe an old toothbrush or something like that.
Absolutely.
Use
Great
a
idea.
little water, but don't spray high powered water.
Yep. So so there's sort of 2 times when you need to do it. One would be you can do it before you do the lubrication, and then you're going to want to do it now after, as a lot of grease and dirt and grime is getting onto the gear. So that's a really good question, and that's maybe it'll be my final tip is as much as you want to try to get all of the lubricant off of the exterior of the chain, you also want to try to get, and you don't have to be a perfectionist about this, you want to try to get as much of the lubricant and dirt and grime as possible off of the gear, the part that's exposed. And so as you run it through, you'll get new gear exposed, and there are 2 sides to it. So I'm using a rag. You can certainly, a toothbrush would get in there much better. If you're using water and soap, you just want to then, when you're done, maybe do a nice quick re-lubrication of the chain once everything is dry, not as heavy duty, and then wipe off all of the excess. If I were to get this really nice and clean tonight, and then I were to ride this bike tomorrow, there a little bit more lubricant would come out from the chain. And so after you lubricate your chain, checking the next day or a couple days after and just taking a rag and wiping off excess lubrication is going to save you a lot of messiness in the future.
We're at time, but I imagine we could stay a few minutes if people have questions that they didn't get a chance to ask.
Yep, happy to.
So now's a great time if anybody had anything they wanted to ask before we wrap up.
You're welcome to everybody. Thank you so much for being here with me.
We'll post the recording as well in a week or so. I'm going to stop recording.